watch where you're throwing your kings, Butterfingers. There's kind of two ways you can view this question. One is a simple or romantic sort of take, which is just say that an empire is a group of people and places that are ruled over by an emperor. The second view kind of decouples the idea from a single individual and instead looks at things more holistically. And generally speaking, empires are defined by more of a sort of in-group, which are considered, the rulers or, the central empire, and the ruled over, the colonies, which are owned, in a manner of speaking, rather than being a part of the empire. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is because I had the more romantic view of empires. If you were to ask me to think of empires, I would think of battles, conquests, and figures like Alexander the Great, Joan of Arc, and Genghis Khan. Now, that's mostly because I was dumb, but also because my deep-rooted exposure to empires as an impressionable young gamer was formed by Age of Empires 1 and 2. Thankfully, Age of Empires 4 now exists, and gives us that more holistic perspective. 4, in a way, acts as a reboot of the series, and though it is numbered to progress the series, it actually takes a step back in terms of the eras that it represents, returning to the mostly medieval that was covered by 2, rather than going forward and progressing past the gunpowder-filled age of exploration of 3. Usually when something like this occurs, the game will improve upon things with modernization of mechanics and an upgrade graphically. It will try and keep the spirit of the base intact. Though 4 does much of that stuff, like improving the polygon count of cutscenes, I think it is rather clear that it wants to send a different message than 2. It's actually a fascinating look at how 2 games that on paper should be the same narratively diverge because of how they tell their stories and use game language. There isn't going to be much analysis when it comes to multiplayer because playing games against other people scares me. So you can consider me to be one of those buy a game purely for the campaign Andys. Anyway, when I was first playing the campaign for 4, there was something that felt lacking about it. I was enjoying the new mechanics and how much of the conflict is built upon holding walls versus breaking them down now that you can put units up there and everything, but I found myself personally less invested in progress, and if we go back to the good old days of yore, the 90s, it'll be clearer why this is the case. Age of Empires 2's campaign. Age of Empires 2's AoE2's campaign is much more in tune with conventional storytelling. We have characters, which are made up of some of the major figures of history that are named in books that, stand out. William Wallace, Joan of Arc, etc. It is ostensibly their exploits, their heroism, that is brought to the fore in Age of Empires 2. And the campaigns, especially the French one, almost exclusively follow these more personal stories. This is a very effective way to gauge the player because of how we intrinsically know what we are capable of and can compare it to what they accomplished in history.
The only person in history to command the armies of an entire nation at the age of 17.
This is also part of the mechanical expression of the game, since these figures are not represented by, your just average units. They're hero units and have much more health, damage, they can heal, and their survival is sometimes explicitly tied to success or failure. They're also given full voice dialogue, and I swear to God that this line will be going through my head even as I cock it off this mortal coil.
The blood on the sword is almost dry.
This all makes playing the campaign really compelling. As a player, you have a heightened value for these units that is reflective of their role in history, and also the fact that they are so tied into the campaign's overall story, and what we mention from mission to mission embeds their importance into your head over and over. Centering the campaigns around these figures keeps you grounded onto the personal aspirations of these people, and the empires they're fighting for. Even when the hero units aren't explicitly playable, the stories that tie you from mission to mission are all about helping them out, achieving their goals, and are almost framed in such a way as to idolize them.
The citizens of Jerusalem proclaimed Saladin as their savior. He offered to free me,
but after 20 years in his service, I have decided to see it out to the end.
This is what Age of Empires 2 most wants to focus on, and so you have a game that is much more concerned with stories and people, conflicts, and the heroism that overcomes them. Empires are made up of people, after all, and according to AoE2, empires survive or die depending on the heroism of its citizens. Without Genghis, for example, would there be a Mongol empire?
The name of Temujin has passed almost into obscurity. His name is replaced with a title, Great Khan, Genghis Khan.
If that is the kind of stuff that made Age of Empires 2 so good, at least, in my opinion, why would 4 not follow a similar formula? And if you haven't played it, it is very good, you should. Unlike 2, the heroes aren't fully voiced, and they're much less integral to the story of a campaign. Now, the more cynical out there would look at this and say that the devs were either lazy or couldn't afford to hire voice actors or whatever, etc, etc. But I have a differing view. Even assuming that they couldn't afford voice actors or whatever, the devs do a really good job of dealing with that limitation by shifting the focus of the narrative of empires being defined by heroes to one that is more academic and holistic in nature. In AoE4, there are some subtle changes to the hero units that I think speak volumes. On an aesthetic level and through the language of UI, they have been made to be less identifiable. In 2, the hero units had voice dialogue that gave them personality.
Sweet Jean, I shall avenge thee.
And this was amplified by how they are depicted in the UI, with a portrait of their faces rather than unit sprites. 4 removes all dialogue and gives them the same speech as regular units. At least as far as I can tell. And the UI, though giving them more prominence than a regular unit with a dedicated icon, lacks the individual personality of the portraits found in 2. The more obvious changes come from the mechanics. Hero units can't die anymore. Instead, they just require another unit to come in to rescue them. Now, this is interesting because it would seem like their immortality makes them more valuable. But really, it serves to make them cheaper, at least in terms of the narrative or the story. This move decouples them from explicit objectives, so they are no longer important to the mission. And since you're no longer trying to baby them anymore, they are no longer as present in your mind, and you are probably focusing more on the battle itself. Additionally, heroes have now been given abilities, which is definitely an upgrade to how they worked in 2, but interestingly, most of these are about buffing surrounding units. So even these special abilities serve to decouple the idea of these hero units single-handedly taking out entire armies, and makes them part of a whole. They are no longer just great warriors. These abilities mechanically convey that they are also leaders. They are still significant and more valuable than a single unit, but they've been brought back down to earth, and I think described through the mechanics more accurately. Following on from this, if we look at a hero's influence on a campaign, we will find a similar sentiment. No longer are the campaigns named after these heroes and following their exploits. They're named in a more holistic way, whether it be the name of the civilization, or maybe a great war that defined it, or maybe even a major city. The campaigns in Age of Empires 4 also take place over a vastly larger stage of time, and I think it's the French campaign that exemplifies all of this quite well. The first mission is very hero-esque, where you take a hero and move them from A to B and have these small skirmishes where the hero shines and their abilities are super important.
Honorably conceding defeat in the duel, Sir Yves Charel joined the cause.
This is actually really thematic, since this mission within the story of the campaign represents a time of romance and sort of idealism of knights and honor.
Little did the two sides know, this was just the beginning of a bitter war that would outlive them all.
But immediately in the second mission, we jump a decade in time as those heroes and what they did become less relevant, and then moving ever onwards through the 100 Years' War as the tyranny of longbows is broken by the French cannons.
France was finally at peace. More than 100 years had passed since the first English chevauchés had scorched the land. The iconic French knights who fought in those early days would not have recognized their own military a century later. The English longbow, once the scourge of France, was no match for French artillery in the last years of the war.
The other campaigns are similar in spirit, with even the Mongol campaign choosing to cover the generals of the army and what they accomplished rather than exclusively the exploits and desires of Genghis Khan. Now, to be fair to AoE2, the Mongol aka Genghis Khan campaign does have missions that take place after the death of the first great Khan, but notice the framing. The preceding missions are about following up on the first Khan's legacy. It is still framed as his empire in spirit that his son has been bestowed.
To them, our army might have been from the underworld itself, still commanded by the shade of the great Khan.
Taking all that together, I think it is a rather compelling case that Age of Empires 4 purposefully devalues the hero units in basically every single way, because empires are just much larger than individuals, lasting well beyond the rule of any one emperor or hero. One of the most striking parts of the new Age of Empires are the cinematics. Again, the heroism is left aside, and instead of specific figures or cinematic high-pitched battles serving as rewards, you just get these beautiful drone shots of current-day landscapes, and overlaid on top are these outline soldiers. It's a really cool decision because it beautifully brings to light the conflict that is about to occur, but with the context of time. Yes, these battles took place in these very real locations, but they exist in the past, and as such have to be conveyed using these outline soldiers. By not using a full render like in Age of Empires 2, or, a full real-world footage thing like you would find in movies, and instead sort of mixing the two together, Age of Empires 4 creates a contrast, and one that graphically forces you to consider the context of these battles as it occurs in time, but also the age of these empires. The game takes this a little bit further in the loading screens. Now, I absolutely love how this is set up. So on the left, you have the real world information as it matters to you from your perspective in time. So, the current day. And as you scan across the screen, you go from the outline soldiers, i.e. the overtly simulated, and then it fades towards the full graphics render, bringing you away from the present and then more fully into the game world with each pixel from left to right. Now, all of this quite nicely maps to what is going on under the hood as the game is actually loading. So here we see the language of video games themselves used to aid something larger than their individual purpose. Cinematics and loading screens, often considered as almost separate entities from the game itself, are in fact part of the whole package and can be used for more than just their base utility as a reward / driver of the story for the former, or conveying the fact that your game isn't in fact frozen for the latter. In this case, they amplify the idea that empires, given their relation to time, cannot be tied to the short lives of individuals. One other thing I love about AoE4 is that it takes a page from StarCraft's book and goes much harder in differentiating the different empires. Now, as you will see in this sick manual that I still have for AoE2, In AoE2, all of the techs and units and stuff that you get throughout the game are pretty samey from civilization to civilization. And there's just like slight differences in which units and which techs any one civilization is able to get. As you can tell from this thing, this is super old. But anyway, one of the brilliant things about 4 is that the economic engine and certain mechanics are unique to certain civilizations or empires, making them much more distinct from one another. The Mongols, for instance, have movable buildings, which matches the reality of their more nomadic way of life. And there are plenty of other ways that the empires are different, like how the Chinese can benefit from, like, you know, age-specific buildings. But unfortunately, we're not doing multiplayer, and we're a campaign Andy over here. So let's look at the Rus. They get a nice little change for their economic engine with the fact that you can shoot deers to gain gold. How good is that? And that's kind of it, apart from the hunting cabins. But really, I wanted to bring the Rus up for what is done in their campaign, so that I can tie things back to Heroes for just a minute. Remember how I said that one of the things that made Age of Empires 2 campaigns sort of stand out and make them more personal was that you got to see the heroes in multiple missions, usually sequentially. The French campaign with Joan of Arc did this a lot. Well, that campaign for the Rus starts you off with a city, and you get a bunch of missions in a row defending that city from attack across the span of, you know, however many years. So instead of devoting character work to a specific hero or leader, it is done to an entire city that was burned and rebuilt and refortified across time that more accurately defined that empire. And as we see through the chapter titles of the campaign, we see its seed as a city grow from that to becoming an empire. Now, one last thing that I came up with quite late in the process for this, which is why I'm cramming it in here right before the conclusion, is the idea of using the narrator in different ways. Now, in Age of Empires 2, the narrators are well acted and can get quite vigorous or solemn depending on the story, but other than the tutorial campaign, they never escape the picture book into the playable parts of the game.
Death is by now an old companion, but for Jean, we will face it again.
This is left mostly to the hero units, who again have voiced dialogue.
Bonjour, Jean. My colleague and I will escort you to the Chateau of the Dauphin, or else we will die trying.
In 4, however, the same narrator that speaks across the stories is the same one that details the events that happen in the game as well.
Caught out of position, the French faced a surprise attack from the English rearguard,
which to me makes AoE4 feel much more documentarian in its vibes than AoE2. Now, more evidence of the game explicitly wanting to convey that documentarian feeling can be found in the rewards that you get for completing campaign missions. Some of them yield really neat videos that show you cool factoids like what it was like going to war as a knight in those days, for example.
no expense was spared to keep knights and nobles in the lap of luxury.
A knight on campaign would expect the best food. So we have game, we have fine meats, we have fruit when it's in season, always cooked, because food is tied in with health as well. That's very important.
I think it's wonderful that Age of Empires 4 is a game that exists. Not just because it represents a game series that I love coming back to life, but it allows an excellent case study in games as a form of expression. Now, Age of Empires 2 is much more conventional, relying on more standard storytelling structures. And you might consider it a bit of a stretch for me to say that Age of Empires 2 defines empires as the stories of heroism of individuals and leaders. It is an older game, after all. It probably had no greater ambition than to provide a compelling experience for its players. But in the comparison to 4, now that that exists, we can see the different focus and derive a meta-narrative from that. 4 isn't just a refinement of the formula of 2, it doesn't just add walls that you can put units on. The cinematics don't just have more polygons. They're substantively different. And I think the same thing can be said for the changes to the heroes. Narratively, the hero change is one that is lesser. They've been devalued in their campaigns, and so naturally the question is, why? And in the context of this game, I think the only real conclusion is that it serves to shift the focus to the empire the hero is a part of. From there, all of the other changes cohesively aid that idea, that empires aren't defined by individuals and the heroics and those kinds of small-scale personal stories, but are so much larger that even those heroes are but footnotes. It was generations of people, the terrain, positioning, resilience of entire cities, alongside the advancements of walls and artillery that better defined the age of empires. Looking at this now, I know where this came from in my mind, but this, I cannot for the life of me remember how I got this, because I would have been very young, and back then I don't remember being able to buy games myself from a shop, because I had no money. So I may have just stolen a game from a friend or something, but it's too late now. It's got my name on it.